Hello, everybody. And nobody left. Yay. It's great. So we're off to a good start. But in all seriousness, I want to thank my panelists at the beginning, because at the end of this, they may not want to talk to me. I'm going to be asking some tough questions. But actually, what we're here to talk about today is the evolution of the wired and the wireless network and how they fit together and what are some of the gaps. But I have some esteemed colleagues and friends up here, and I'm going to introduce them briefly, and hopefully they will say something of themselves to introduce themselves to you as well. And I'll start on the other end with Andy Champagne. Andy runs R&D for Akamai, and so all the cool stuff that we're not supposed to talk about. And Don is the CEO of FiberLight, and if you don't know who FiberLight is, you should make a point to learn. They are a great fiber network that not that many people, everybody should know about, I should say. And then, of course, Najam, and I've been given very specific instructions. Najam supports the network team at the largest social media company, Facebook. So I'll hand the baton to Andy. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you do. And
yeah, no, thank you very much. Thanks for the intro. And thanks for having me here. So at Akamai, I'm responsible for the labs team, which is kind of our R&D division, working on new phase, new platform projects and capabilities. Whether it's enhancements to our core offerings that the company's known for in the CDN space, or things going in different directions, our blockchain, stateful platforms, IoT solution stacks, and other similars. And we're mostly, this is an interesting cross-section because we're mostly kind of on top of a lot of this. We're very much an app layer company, obviously, dealing with moving flows around and processing them. But we're obviously built upon things that are built upon things. And that's why this discussion is just super relevant to what we do and important to participate in. So thanks.
And Don?
Thanks, Jezzibell. It's great to be here. And just real quickly, I'd summarize my recent opportunities over the last several years in the telecommunications space as really being a member of a team that is building things, going back to my time at XO Communications, where we built new products and services and positioned ourselves to serve the carrier wholesale market. Spent 2 years at Edge Connects, really starting to formulate and build out, certainly in cooperation with Akamai as well, the emerging edge and edge ecosystem that we hear a lot about today. And now really culminating my opportunity here with FiberLight, being a part of a great team that's had a wonderful track record for over a decade of design, engineering, and building mission-critical, relevant fiber networks. So pretty excited about the future, looking ahead, and I think this is a great panel to be a part of. So thanks for having me.
I guess I'm up.
Go Najam.
Thank you. Welcome, thank you for being here. I'm excited to be in this conversation. As Jezzibell said, I support the network team at Facebook, which essentially any bits moving around in the Facebook world, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, anywhere in the world is something that we worry about and something that we have interest in. Obviously, the edge conversation and how we reach end users is very, very relevant to what we do from a network perspective. At heart, I'm a network geek. I've always been part of building the network infrastructure from my early days as an engineer. So the internet is the crux of where my being is. So I enjoy network. You can't make me do anything else other than network. So not networking on people, though, even though I work for a social company.
And I'll introduce myself last, and I'll go into my perception of the market, and then I'll let all the panelists chime in on their perspectives on how things are affecting them and what are the challenges that they face and what are the gaps that we as a collective can potentially bridge. So I'm Jezzibell Gilmore. I have 20 years tenure in the telecom industry. Even though I look like I might be 12. So, but What I would say is we created this company called PacketFabric with full automation and for transport. And I've been listening to some TED Talks, and so I think Simon Sinek says that people buy because of why you create a product, not what you've created. And I've been thinking about why have I created PacketFabric? And so I think that the reason why we created PacketFabric is because we want to create a better world, better connections, better connect everybody. And so I look at the behavior of the new generation, and personally I have a son, he's 7, he just turned 7, and we were having this conversation, me among my panelists. He's 7, when we go to a restaurant, the first thing he asks the wait staff is not, may I have apple juice or an ice cream? He asks, what's the name of the restaurant and what's your Wi-Fi password? I don't know if you have similar experience, but they live in the generation where they believe connectivity is everywhere and they live in an attached world. So it isn't just connectivity so you can see your email. They want to have everything at their fingertips. He asked me the other day why our 3-year-old Tesla doesn't have Wi-Fi with it, because the new car apparently came with Wi-Fi. And I didn't have a response to that. But I want you to each think about your own behavior, examine the people that are in your lives, right? Your kids, the children around you, the new generation, the people you work with. How do they use data? And what is being utilized? And how are we moving forward from this point on? And when they think about wireless, that's all wireless. Information exists everywhere in their world. And in our world, when you think of data, it's attached to something. There's a wire to it. That's what we do, right? So I think there's a huge divide still as we continue to grow the data set, the consumption of data exponentially. The connection from the physical world, where Don builds the fiber to the towers to the DAS, and that isn't quite bridged. I think Don was talking about the consumption still at 1 gig, 10 gig level, right? In the data world, I think in Andy and Najam's world, we're looking at not terabits, but petabits and even more, much larger data sets. So how do we bridge that gap? And so with that, I don't want to be the one that's standing on the soapbox. I will hand a question out and then we'll hopefully derive from there, right? So you see the large data set coming, right? And the new technologies and the new applications being created today. And what do you see as the gap, and what is the one challenge you think that's most significant that we face today that you're working on?
Maybe I'll start and I'll just say, so I have a 5-year-old and I've taken a distinctly different approach, which is I got her a 486, a 300 baud modem, and a FreeBSD CD-ROM because I don't want her to have it any easier than I did, and I'll just more rapidly give her technology introductions. Well, by the time she's 10, she'll probably have an iPad. I'm only half kidding.
No PTSD, do you?
None at all. Yeah, none at all. Yeah. Yeah, so I think as we look at the ecosystem today, we've seen a ton of changes, and I'm going to generically, I think, address your point. We've seen a ton of changes in the last 10 years, where in the last 10 years, we're very much, previous 10 years from now, we're on a very client-server approach, where you made a request and you got something back, and that's totally changed, where today messaging and communication is multi-point, and it's more of a session-based thing, where there's things in communication protocol, whether it's HTTP, QUIC, MQTT, going back and forth between you and a variety of places on the network. So it's really turned into something that's bidirectional, and where we're each carrying something that's both a client and a server, to use that old kind of terminology set. And I think that's driven substantial changes in the network and desires around the profiles of latency and other attributes of the network. And I think the unification of those between wired, which has always had pretty good performance characteristics, and wireless, which has typically been trying to catch up with wired, is going to be interesting. And I think, obviously 4G is a huge step forward. Wi-Fi 5, 6, and the forthcoming Wi-Fi 7 are going to be very helpful there. And 5G is going to be super interesting to see how that helps filling in and what kind of experiences that can enable that will further push that shift where resources are. So wide angle, generic answer, but it's going to be really interesting to see with the next 5 or 10 years how flows evolve.
Don?
Yeah, and I think to build onto that, we talk a lot about wireless and wireline, but equally, we were talking this morning as well, it really begins with that device and, the trade-offs. And I think going forward, say for the next 5 years, it's going to be really about understanding the respective constraints or the physics, if you will, of, the different, whether it's the device and what can be stored versus, compute. And then where do you start to put these last mile 5G links that obviously will drive more dots on the map, as we like to say, which then will also drive either the additional use of RF to backhaul and or more fiber. So I think as we go forward collectively, it's going to be really about understanding that edge ecosystem, and being respective of the constraints. And it's I think the evolution from 3G to 4G or LTE was a little bit more straightforward, simply because it was about, and I'll oversimplify it, of course, but just changing out radios and spectrum with bigger, fatter backhaul, and obviously that's going to hit a point of exhaustion, as we're already starting to experience. So it'll be a great challenge for the broader ecosystem, if you will, to understand one another's respective constraints in the next 3 to 5 years.
Cool. All right, I'll take a slightly different view and talk about sort of building the network from the inside out conversation. I think one of the things that I hold true or dear is that the more bandwidth you have, the more things people will find to do with the bandwidth. So actually, the more bandwidth, the better off we all are, because all our businesses are growing equally in terms of our own businesses. It doesn't matter what you do, fiber or application, bandwidth drives a lot of use cases. And Andy's PTSD aside on modems, I think connectivity has become sort of an essential element of our lives. Try losing your phone for a couple of days and see what happens. You can't even get a ride because, like, oh shit, how do I get Uber now? We can't do that. So then the next question is ubiquitous. How do we provide that capacity everywhere, network connectivity everywhere? And the third element, I think what we're really talking about in this conversation is capacities. How do we increase the end user's capacity or availability of the network capacity in ubiquitously everywhere in the world? That's really the challenge. Now, if you think about capacity, fiber is king. You can't beat fiber capacities. But fiber obviously is the hardest thing to get to anywhere, because you're talking about physical builds and physical digging of ground and things like that. So it takes a lot of effort to do that. Wireless is always limited by physics, and you have the limitations of physics in very broad terms. The more capacity you want, the less coverage you get. The more coverage you have, the less capacity you have. How do you find that? And we're always making sort of improvements to get there. That's what 4G is about. That's what 5G is about. You'll get more capacity. But if you look at the actual network build on that, 5G will have to have a lot more density, because the coverage is a lot smaller. Coverage area is a lot smaller than what 4G used to be. So what you'll end up with is having to build more fiber to connect those 5G spots. So 5G it's more equivalent to Wi-Fi type hotspots. So if you think about every building almost every floor has Wi-Fi hotspots, but they're all connected through a wire somewhere. And wire could be copper, but most of the time it's becoming fiber more and more. So that's the same implementation needs to happen in the 5G world, where you're going to have to build a lot more backhaul network to connect all the 5G back and increase the capacity at the end. Then the other problem that we see at the application and the service layer is, in the end, what we're really talking about is IP traffic. How do we get IP traffic? So when a 5G network provides you a radio signal, or the RAN network, like the Ericsson conversation earlier before us, was that you build a radio signal and provide radio connectivity, but how do you run IP traffic? And where does that IP network or IP traffic terminated? Becomes a more interesting conversation. We have meet-me points or exchanges or POPs, whatever your terminology, but they're not sufficient enough to deal with the amount of penetration you could have in a Wi-Fi model. So we'll have to kind of think about where IP traffic is terminated and how do we build the edge further closer to the end user. So really what you're really doing is expanding the edge out to get closer and closer to the end user.
Just to add on maybe to that point, which is, this has been the continuation of 25-year trend on the internet, where we've kind of been going through this fractal enhancement of detail. You know, we started off with 2 to 3 May East, May West, Palo Alto Internet Exchange. Now, just in the continental United States, we've probably got 10 to 20 key sites that you need to be at. There's probably another 0 or possibly 2 in the next 10 years that you need to be at, because the sites are going to be smaller, they're going to be more localized, but they're going to be representative of an increasing amount of traffic that's going to flow through the increased backhaul that's going to exist. So essentially, in order to provide 5G coverage and the demand, you're going to just have a lot more 5G access points, you're going to have a lot more Wi-Fi, and it's all going to have to go somewhere. And that's going to lead to a lot of new facilities that, you know, you're not going to know them off the top of your head, but many of them are out there, many of them are being built, and that's really where the new edge is being constructed on a day-to-day basis.
So I'm going to summarize just a little bit, and I'm going to throw another question back at you guys. So what I heard is, in order to accommodate the new demand for wireless connectivity capacity, we need to build a lot more fiber densely in the metro areas to support the deployment of antennas. And there's a challenge between the RAN translation to the IP, and we're going to be seeing a lot more core locations or edge core locations that are going to be an order of magnitude more than what we're seeing, or possibly multiple orders of magnitude than we're seeing today. So those sounds like a lot of investment. Ching, 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 lots of money spent by somebody somewhere. Is that, who is that going to be? Who's going to be spending that money? And what does it mean, and what are the gaps, right? I think I heard that there's fiber, there's IP, and there's new edge POP locations. How do those connect, and what are the gaps we see today that we should be looking at to bridge to help us get there? Because I think there's some interesting missing pieces today. So.
Yeah, and I would add to your list, so there's going to be money spent on additional spectrum, and there'll be money spent on, you know, don't forget, much as the wireline we've been talking about, software-defined networking, well, the radio access network's going through some version of that as well, so which will also generate, you know, edge locations for the purposes of, you know, that next generation radio access network as well, that can benefit as well from the software. But that'll be another investment area as well, you know, from the standpoint of CapEx.
Absolutely. So where is that money coming from? Which element of all these, or is it the organizations we spoke about is going to be spending money to build all this infrastructure? We all know building infrastructure is good for the world, but who's going to be spending that capital? Is it going to be the MNO? Because it sure isn't going to be the end users. We don't have billions of dollars. Well, maybe we do, because we pay the MNOs, the mobile network providers, right? Or is it the government? Like, who are the sectors, the companies are going to be spending the money to build this, and what are the gaps that we need to fill?
Yeah, I think you can certainly trace the economic model of where does the flow go, and ultimately, I mean, the end users, you know, are consuming or being monetized or somehow producing the activity. It would seem in most use cases that kind of propagate the model. And, you know, so if you look at companies like Akamai, obviously we're investing in, you know, links between locations, we're investing in data center space, we're investing in access, you know, working with Don and others to accomplish that. So, you know, certainly our investment then comes from our customers who are asking to distribute their content, to enable security offerings for them, to bring state and compute and storage to the front, to the edge of the internet for them, and that obviously then propagates back to their business model. So it's really all over the place, because the reality is there's a collapse between everybody wants to getting online is not a thing anymore. You're already online, and now it's about the competition of being at the forefront of that and having a world-class application, having a world-class web experience, and just patching the holes that used to be there. So your whole flow process, whatever your business is, needs to be enabled, and you have to do that in a way where it's fast and performant all the time. And then, so we're out there trying to contract and be in the right spots to make that possible.
So you not only own the content and the application and have experience touching the end users, how do you look at this? Are you guys making investment into?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of interesting part. Sometimes people don't get the perspective of what it takes to build a service of a Facebook scale. We're probably building one of the larger networks out there in the world, from dark fiber, actually digging ground, working with Don and other companies to actually dig ground and put new fiber in. We have a significant number of submarine cable projects all around the world because the user base is across the world. So we're building capacity across the continents, across the world. The interesting thing that we need to drive is how do we get more efficient at building capacity? If you look at today, the world is still pretty fragmented from a business point of view, and the investments are not leveraged. So for example, if you're building a fiber path from Seattle to Chicago, people are wanting to build 2 or 3 of their own, and nobody builds one because there's not enough business for any one company to build that path because it costs that much. Can we find easy ways to pool resources and actually build that path and share that? That stuff is not happening as much as I would like to see. There's a lot of investment going on. You can name the large players in the business that actually all have bandwidth needs, and they're all driving spend. It's just that the spend is fragmented. We've done a little bit of work on the submarine cable industry where we've done partnerships with the Microsofts and the Googles of the world and build cables together. But in the rest of the world, it's still very fragmented. You see that in the radio world as well. You go to a tower, you see everybody's antenna, right? Everybody has to do their own, and it's fragmented space. How can we leverage each other? That world is what we're not solving problems together yet.
Just one area where we are solving them a little together is actually on the power side of the equation. So we've seen a lot of partnerships in, wind farms, solar farms, and kind of generation methods for powering some of the infrastructure. Because, we have several active partnerships where we work with other companies, Apple, Microsoft, on just taking shares of renewable energy production. And it would almost be great if we could apply that same model recursively to the infrastructure build out that we're running.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I struggle with is that network or infrastructure people still want to compete on. Power, they're not trying to compete on. Whenever you have no competition, then you start sharing and solving problems together. Infrastructure is still something that people feel like they want to compete on.
Yeah, I just a plug there. I mean, one of the components of our model is really to, we're not everywhere, but we're in key locations, and we take that approach of enabling, in some, historically you might have said enabling competitors, but I think in a very balanced way, especially, the large companies such as Facebook and others. I mean, they have certainly the resource, the smarts, and the capability to go build things. I learned that from the data center space. So how do you enable, the large infrastructure players that want to buy the way they want to buy in the method they want to buy it in, but at the same time leverage the additional capacity to serve, whether it's enterprises, additional macro towers or small cells. So I think this element of cooperation, early stages, but there's a way for it to work, and there's a way for it to continue to. And I agree. I think it'll become necessary, especially as things get more spread to the edge, because there's many cases, there's many parts of the country that it's hard to really justify digging up dirt.
Right. So the reason why that I wanted to be here today is because I want everybody to start thinking about collaboration, and I'm glad that you guys came naturally to that conclusion. And there are so much to be done infrastructure-wise. And from the economics perspective, if we can collaborate, everybody could gain from that, right? So if a service provider needs to get from location A to location Z, and so does 5 other service providers, but they each want to commission their build with someone like Don with FiberLight, and it takes the one company that is going to take a bigger risk than all the other ones because they have to make a business case to say we're going to take a risk and have commissioned Don FiberLight to build this for us, and then Don's going to have to say, well, hopefully there's several others behind him to come and pay for this build, but we still have to charge an X dollar amount to make sure that we're not losing money on this build. What if those 5 players can come together and say, hey, let's go build this and together, because we're going to share the resources and we're going to share the cost and pay Don maybe even a little more money than what he would from that single player, right? And then everybody else's cost is reduced. Those kind of collaboration is what is going to drive the next wave of infrastructure expansion. And we have not seen that, possibly because of the greed and the capitalism culture, which, we're all in business. No one is here because they don't want to make money. But I think we have to look at the end goal of what we're all trying to achieve here and figure out how to help each other get there, because at the end of the day, this is going to be a win-win-win situation for everyone. And so, and something that we just said, right, here's the economics. Let's maybe instead of looking from the economics perspective, let's look at the collaboration from the technology perspective. Because what we often look at is, oh, you sell services. What services can I buy from your current inventory to fill this gap I have or this hole I have? Oh, you sell round pegs. I have a square hole. I guess I'm going to try to buy the closest round peg to my square hole to fit my need. But instead of doing that, what if we don't look at the economics and look at the existing inventory? Let's talk on the technology level, the true business objectives, right? How do we move the conversation from what can I buy from you, or here's what I've got to sell, to here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Can we do it together? Well,
I can jump in. I think Andy mentioned performant. In the end, latency or performance is important. You look at your own experience. If you launch an app and it takes 10 seconds to load, you'll probably not stick with the app and move to something else, and that the infrastructure has to support that. How we provide that experience is a lot to do with the infrastructure itself. So caching being sort of one of the things that we have to do in the edge world. If the edge has to extend out and get closer to the end user, we have to find more efficient ways to build at the edge and continue to invest in that space. Today, it's a very fragmented model. The big guys, including ourselves, so we're as bad as everybody else. So Netflix, Google, Facebook, we all have our own caching infrastructure, and that puts a lot of pressure on the ISPs to go deploy our infrastructure or our caching devices into every network. How do we find better ways to solve those type of problems? There's a collaboration work to be done in figuring out ways to solve that problem. Akamai tries to solve that problem by providing a service, and that's one of the ways you can actually solve it. But trying to find ways that we can still do optimization at the application layer while maintaining a general infrastructure, there's a lot of work to be done in that space. So that's sort of one of the things that we could do from an engineering perspective that we can solve problem-wise.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to it too. It's, the telecommunications industry is notorious for it, right? I mean, the round peg, square hole, or vice versa. But it's the old debate between you want dark, I want to sell you lit, and I think we've taken the approach of you have to respect the constraint. And one example is all of this radio access network that's coming. There's proprietary protocols that something called CIPRI. I don't offer it, and it's not a traditional transport service, but some could argue it's necessary in the formulation of the next generation radio access network. So if I sell dark fiber, I don't have to worry about CIPRI, but I let the end user have what they need in order to fulfill that component to it. So yeah, I mean, it's just kind of this reinvention of positioning infrastructure in a different way, and not force that legacy thinking, respecting the constraints, I think.
Yeah, just we're never at a final state, right? We're continually evolving here, and it's going to continue. I think the last 10 years or 5 years have seen people working more independently. I think the next 5 or 10 you may see consortiums form to help build and run things, but that adds overhead, that adds politics, which can make things evolve a little bit slower. So I think letting individuals, companies run and build on their own certainly makes sense, but it also makes sense when you have things that are perhaps more mature or more predictable in what they're doing to have kind of things pulled together, because it's going to be more cost efficient all around. And to Najim's point, absolutely, Akamai's got a service approach that we've been doing for the last 20 plus years on how we offer our capabilities. That's not the only way. There's other ways to go about it. We arrogantly think our formula kind of works. It makes sense for us and our customers. But we're also busy trying to develop and produce better, new, improved services on top of that platform. Evolving.
Absolutely. And to encourage the entrepreneurial spirit, so if you are an entrepreneur, I want you to think about what's being set up here. There are opportunities in the evolving economy of wired to wireless, and there are technologies that we may know or not know today, that services that isn't necessarily available but is offered as inside organizations such as Facebook or large other organizations that can be monetized to the world, to the economy as a whole. So that's something I also want to encourage, right? And to take that message from here to what the audience, what the conference NEDAS actually talks about, which is the small cell and DOS systems. When you implement a DOS system, what does it connect to? And take a step back. Instead of looking at the micro level, look at the macro level. Where does it go? Who's using it? And who owns the user? And who owns the data? Take a look at the power dynamics of the existing ecosystem and think about what power is the DOS service provider that you have, and think about everyone sitting up here. They each hold a different position in the food chain, and what can you do to change that? And that is really the true evolution, from my perspective, of wired to wireless. So I think I'm going to open up the audience for some questions.
I'm sorry, we are actually at our time. I apologize.
Well, we have, okay.
I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
The panel will be available to ask those questions too, and I encourage you to do that. I'm
Oh,
so sorry.
perfect. No, that's all right. So there's someone with a question. We'll go to the back end for that question. So, great.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.